Hello and good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for joining me. I'm Dr. Philip Macmillan, and if this is the first time you're meeting me, I'm a physician in the United Kingdom. I've been focused on COVID-19 and autoimmunity around the disease since early 2020. I've been trying to make that scientific point clearly because it has an impact on how we treat, how we manage, and how the pandemic progresses. But today, this is a relatively last minute decision to do this live. And it's focused around a tweet that was put out today by Dr. Asim Malhotra, where he was discussing on Fox News about whether or not there should be liability to the industry if there are any problems. And so I thought this is an important point. And who else could I ask to talk to me about it other than the person I'd spoken to about a year ago, Susan Langois? And we've got her here. Hi, Susan. Did I pronounce that correctly? It just struck me. I got that right.
Yes, you did.
Excellent. And so we've got Susan here, and Susan was in the industry, in the pharma industry, for over 40 years. You're retired now, and so you can be very candid with regards to what goes on in the industry. And that's what we're hoping for. And so could I ask you, Susan, to just introduce yourself and let us know a little bit more about you before we start talking about the regulatory issues?
Good evening or morning or afternoon. Yes, I'm Susan Langois. I started in the biologics industry, specifically a vaccine company back in 1972. And I worked through that company for 20 years. I've worked with a blood replacement firm, a medical device combination product that had a biologic in it, and then in Prostate Cancer Canada, looking at research of treatments for prostate cancer. So I've been in the industry for about 40 years, consulted for the last 5, and been retired for the last 5 years. So I have a lot of history. I'm not as much up to date on the current, even though I try to keep myself as current as possible.
Excellent. And that's why I thought that it was so important to get you to participate, Susan, because I think that there's so many things that we don't understand about the industry. And it helps when you have somebody who can be quite frank, because it is quite difficult for people to speak out, isn't it? When you were working, did you have issues when you spoke out about stuff?
Speaking outside the company wasn't something that was encouraged, but I certainly spoke up within companies and made sure that any concerns I had were addressed. And I was the squeaky wheel. So if they weren't being addressed to my satisfaction, I just kept at it, kept bugging. I would go higher up the ranks until I got the right person to listen. So yes, I had lots of issues within the various companies that I worked with, but I never had to go beyond the company itself.
And does it have a direct impact on your ability to work? Will they fire you if you speak out? That's the fundamental thing that causes people to just go along.
It is, and we at least I had to sign agreements when I was hired that I would not divulge any proprietary information that was given to me. I could not leak it outside. My husband's telling me I've got reflections in my glasses.
It's fine. It's fine.
So yes, it is difficult. You can be fired if you divulge something outside of the company that is considered confidential or proprietary. The squeaky wheel is not accepted, and people would be concerned about losing their job. And if not the job, they may never get hired again as a regulatory person if they were to divulge a concern that wasn't something that the company wanted made public.
Wow. So it is not dangerous, it's difficult. And I think that's something that's important for people to understand is that oftentimes people are looking at livelihoods, their jobs, their careers, and it's not always so easy, even if there are issues, to step up and make a stand on it. So let's listen to what was on Fox News recently with Dr. Malhotra, and then we'll discuss a little bit about how we have gotten to this position. And that's why I found it so valuable to have you here, Susan. So let's take a
UK cardiologist who says he was one of the first to get the Pfizer vaccine. Dr. Malhotra, great to see you tonight. Your reaction to what the Pfizer CEO would not answer in that back and forth, which was really a one-way conversation with the Rebel News reporters.
Good evening, Laura. Well, I think before we discuss this, I think we have to ask ourselves why are we even asking this question? You know, you've alluded to this at the beginning. We're dealing with one of the poorest efficacious pharmacological interventions with the worst safety profile, which has become the most profitable in the history of medicine. And that really sums up a system failure behind all of why we've got to this stage. I've described this before as being probably the greatest miscarriage of medical science that we've witnessed in our lifetime. And the reason for that is, you know, we were sold on this idea. I was double jabbed, you said that correctly, took the 2 jabs of the Pfizer vaccine very early on, January 2021, and then even went on Good Morning Britain to try and help tackle vaccine hesitancy because, you know, in medicine, vaccines are synonymous with safe and effective. We all believed this was going to be as effective as other vaccines that we've used. And ultimately, when we started rolling it out, very quickly we found out that it didn't stop transmission. It didn't really have much of an effect on stopping infection. And in terms of efficacy, my own analysis found that certainly during the Delta wave, you have to vaccinate hundreds, if not thousands of people, depending on your age, to prevent one COVID death as a best case scenario. But what's most concerning with all of this, Laura, the most egregious aspect of all of this is the safety profile. So reanalysis published in the journal Vaccine of Pfizer and Moderna's own trials found that the rate of serious adverse events, and we're talking about hospitalization, disability, life-changing event, was at least 1 in 800. That's been replicated in the real world. Norway gave a figure of about 1 in 926. Likely, again, an underestimate because this is just in the first few months after the vaccine. And we now have data showing that it's very likely that several months after the vaccine, the mRNA jab is likely causing people to have heart attacks and cardiac arrest. My own father died 6 months after the second jab, and when I wrote about this in a peer-reviewed journal, it was accepted there was a likely possibility here. So we're dealing with something really quite extraordinary. And the question is, did Pfizer, did Albert Bourla know, right? And I find it very difficult to believe, given this independent reanalysis, that they didn't know that. Now, even if they did know it, what we know historically, Laura, is we have to accept this and understand this at the root. You know, these drug companies, pharmaceutical companies, have a legal obligation to produce profit for their shareholders. They do not have a legal requirement to give you the best treatment. And the real scandals are that regulators failed to prevent misconduct by industry, and that doctors, academic institutions, and medical journals collude with industry for financial gain. But if you look, ever since these so-called crimes were committed, nothing changed in the system, Laura, to stop this happening again. Many of these companies end up making more profit from the marketing and sales of these fraudulent drugs in the past than they did from the fines. No one got fired. No one lost their job. And Peter Gosha, one of the co-founders of the Cochrane Collaboration, the BMJ, wrote not so long ago, we need to create a system, Laura, where the fines need to be so large that these companies risk going bankrupt and that senior executives could potentially face jail sentences if they are found.
Right, that's what I was...
Acquiesces in these crimes. So, yeah.
Dr. Malhotra, let me just jump in. I think you hit the nail on the head. We've got to roll, unfortunately, but I think it's got to be a lot more than money because they have a ton of money. I think there has to be criminal liability at some point if you knew that the so-called medical intervention that your company was pushing was going to cause harm to people or could cause harm to a significant number of people without really any measurable benefit. That's where the rubber meets the road, and you've had a lot of guts to speak out about this. Very quickly, sum up. Very quickly.
One thing I think we shouldn't forget, there's a lot of people vaccine injured. I'm having to look after them as well and deal with them. It's really awful how they've been gaslighted. And I think one of the things the Pfizer CEO can do, maybe to redeem himself a little bit in all of this, is to say, we are going to give a considerable amount of our profits to helping treat the vaccine injured and do research into vaccine injuries.
Yeah, that was a powerful statement, wasn't it, Susan? And it raises some very important questions. And this is why I want to get some of your thoughts about what's going on. And I think in order for the public to understand how complicated it is, you need to explain the history as to where we are now. How did we get here with regards to regulation?
Yes, that's an important place to start. So when I first started working for the vaccine manufacturer, that was in the early 70s, the manufacturers of vaccines were private. They were either owned by universities or government groups. So as far as profits, they made very little. We were always in the red. Because vaccines are given to healthy people to prevent a disease, they were not charging a lot for them. And a lot of them would go through UNICEF to countries all over the world. So the companies themselves were funded. The research was done in the universities. It would be transferred to the company who would then produce it for market. In the early 70s, the vaccine companies were going bankrupt. They couldn't continue that way. So there were groups of government. They were basically 50-50 government and private investors. In Canada, it was called the Canadian Development Corporation. They supported vaccine companies. So in order to keep them making the vaccines and distributing them, and the government was the group that was paying for them, it wasn't out of pocket for citizens. We had private, but a lot of it was government investment. So again, that was a way to keep these companies going. And then the liability started. People were starting to get the idea that if they thought they were damaged by a vaccine, they would sue. And in the US, these were multi-million-dollar suits. So it got to the point where a lot of the vaccine companies that were competitors of my company ended up going under. They could no longer survive making vaccines. Some of them diversified. Some of them ended up adding some drugs to their portfolio so that they could make some money on the drugs, but not, and continue to provide these vaccines. So that was in the 70s. And so the companies, as I said, they had very expensive manufacturing processes. They were highly regulated. You have all those costs. And come the 80s, they started to bring these vaccine companies to the public. So that was when the shareholder concepts was introduced. So you now have people investing money in a company, not because of what they're making, but because they think they're going to make a profit. So the shareholders were investing. But again, they were investing for long term. They figured this was for the retirement. There'd be young people investing in these companies. So we have the shareholders. But at the same time, the regulators and the governments decided these legal suits were still going to kill these companies. So they removed the liability from the law. So vaccine manufacturers were not subjected to liability. That was removed. You couldn't sue the company. So that's the 80s. So now you've got shareholders, liability being removed. So that's back in the 80s. So in the 90s, that's the start of companies buying out other companies, basically to minimize the number of competitors. So you have small vaccine manufacturers being bought out by big pharma. Pharma that figured, okay, we're going to add the vaccine to our portfolio, but we have a lot of other products. So that helped to finance the vaccine business. But they also saw there were opportunities for new diseases and large populations. They started to increase the price of the vaccines. So again, that's now starting to be shareholder driven. They want to make profits, so they look at opportunities to do that. So when you have a large company buying out another company, they have to recoup that expense or that investment. So the shareholders would put pressure on these companies to start doing something about the vaccine part of the business to be able to recoup what they spent in purchasing that business. And basically, they were paying the shareholders off of the small company to be able to take it over. Then you get to the 2000s, and vaccines became very expensive to make because the population is growing. So you're having to make either larger batches or a lot of smaller batches. The regulations increased, so there was a lot more monitoring of what was going on. And biologics are the most heavily regulated product in the industry. Every batch had to be released. You have to be inspected every year by every country that's buying your product. So if we were selling products to the UK, we would be inspected by them. If Japan, they'd come inspect. So you would have a lot of inspections every year. That costs money. So it was also costing the regulators money. So they brought in 1986, they brought in the fee structure, fee for service. So regulators started to charge the pharmaceutical companies a fee for submitting an IND, which is an investigational new drug application, when you want your final approval, inspections, labeling changes, everything. There was a fee associated with it. Now, at the time that happened, I actually was on committees both in Canada and the US objecting to it, not because we thought there'd be a conflict of interest. We never thought that, but it was going to add to the cost of producing vaccines. So we had to look at our budgets, and we actually would decide that some products weren't worth making or researching, because not only did you have the cost of clinical trials, but now you have all these annual costs that you had to pay the regulators for. And it wasn't just the US, it was Canada and other countries were starting to charge fees. So by the time you got to 2020, the pandemic, you have lots of pressures. You have the shareholders that are looking at opportunities. So new technologies, let's see if we can do something with that. You have an opportunity for mass vaccination. So when you look at what has happened over the years, we're really in a position where there is no one group accountable or responsible. Everybody's pointing fingers at everybody else, because you have the manufacturer, you've got the shareholders, you've got the regulators, you've got the government saying to mandate these vaccines, when that wasn't what the manufacturers started out with. That wasn't what the regulators approved it for in the first point. So it's really difficult now to go back. We'll never be able to go back as it was in the 70s, where there is no influence from anybody. We're in this position today where everybody knows everything, but nobody does anything because they can blame somebody else.
Wow. Now, that is a fascinating piece of information. And very few people understand this. This is a complicated situation. And in a sense, it almost sounds as though it's primed for an event like the pandemic to completely pull the rug out from everybody. Is that where we are now? This has just been a buildup of a nightmare situation of regulation, and now suddenly, when you have a pandemic and you need even more speed, everything disappears. Is that about right?
Well, I'm not sure if it's completely correct, but there's been a lot of influence that the manufacturers put on the regulators. The government puts a lot of influence, has a lot of influence over the regulators, especially in this pandemic. I think what is happening, and this is just my own opinion, I have no proof of this, but what appears to be happening is everybody is looking for opportunities to satisfy the requirements of society. society wants to be protected, but at the same time, when something goes wrong, society is going to blame. So you've got governments in the situation of the pandemic. People are dying. We have to do something. Our citizens expect us to do something. The regulators are saying we don't want to be the bottleneck, so we're going to find ways to streamline. You've got the pharma whose shareholders saying take this opportunity and see if you can introduce a new technology, because this is the only time you're going to be able to do it quickly. I mean, there's just so many opportunities there for error because everybody's under pressure. And then you've got the public who, although they wanted things done quickly, expected that it would be done the same way. And I don't know how they could have thought that. You can't do things the same way in a short time frame. I mean, so I think where we are is, yes, it's a mess. It's a mess that's going to take a lot to fix.
You said something there, and I'm going to ask you a question. When you saw how quickly we were progressing with regards to the emergency use for the vaccine, what were your thoughts? Were you casual? Were you cautious? Were you worried?
Yeah, so when we first heard that they were developing vaccines quickly, I naively thought they were going to do it the same way as we do flu every year. They would take the COVID virus and they would produce a vaccine by the old methodologies. And some did that. And I thought, okay, every year we approve flu vaccines in 6 months. So they take the known virus, they produce the vaccine, it gets through very quickly. But that's a process that is well established. So when they first started with the vaccine rollout, it was for elderly people. So I'm retired, but I'm 70. So now the whole world knows I'm 70. But we were talking about my friends and neighbors that are in their 80s and 90s. The risk of them dying from COVID was very high. So I was pushing for them. I was helping them get their appointments. I was ready to get the vaccine. But by the time they reached my age group, they were starting to roll out the mRNA vaccines, which I knew was a new technology. And I knew that they couldn't have done all the work that they would have been required to do if we were going by the old review and analysis methods. So I started to get concerned about that. And I looked at what it was, how it was manufactured, how quickly. That was okay. But then I thought, well, where's the long-term data for this technology? Are they turning me into a GMO? Am I producing my own protein? So they're not, the dose is not regulated. They don't know how much my body's going to produce. So I started to get concerned at that point. I guess that was maybe 4 months into it, into the rollout of the vaccines. And in Canada, we only had the two, Moderna and Pfizer. So only the mRNA. So I decided, my husband and I decided we're not getting vaccinated, and we have not had one dose. So I was concerned, but only because of the data that started to become available. And I did have access to the government's websites where I could see the clinical data that they had and didn't have. And they had not tested in pregnant women. They had not tested in people with autoimmune conditions. There were a lot of groups of people that they had not tested it in. They said that in their monograph. And yet the government was telling us it's safe and effective for everybody, including pregnant women. So that's when I really started to get concerned and started to talk to friends and relatives.
Wow. And that's a big decision at that time because so many people were afraid and they wanted protection. Now you have a degree of understanding of the science of the industry and so on. And so one could say that, okay, fine, that you've done that research, but most people weren't in that position. It's a hard question to ask, but what responsibility do individuals have for getting information?
Interesting. I think people were very fearful. and they did not want to assess the situation on their own because they were just so frightened of this disease and the impact on the medical or the healthcare system. And just I have many friends and family where they know my background, they know my understanding of regulations and regulatory approvals, and I advised them not to take it, but I told them this is the situation. It's been released on emergency drug release only. It's not fully released. There's a lot of missing data. I don't believe it's safe in everyone, but if you are in a vulnerable group, like the elderly group or somebody that's got conditions that might be severely affected by getting COVID, then you probably should get vaccinated, but you should really think about it. Most of my friends, matter of fact, all of my friends and family, except for a couple, told me that how could I say that when the government and the regulators are telling us it's safe and effective in everybody? They wouldn't lie. They wouldn't give us misinformation. I said, they're not lying. They're just withholding certain things. But people didn't listen. People didn't have the bandwidth to do their own research. They were overwhelmed with the amount of information coming through the media, through social media. They just didn't know how to tell the difference between misinformation, disinformation. I think the problem is, even though, yes, everybody is responsible for doing research themselves and make decisions for themselves, it can be really overwhelming, the amount of information that's out there today. Like, I mean, I'm talking about the last decade.
Wow, I appreciate you being so candid, Susan, and I can see that Dr. Malhotra had a similar issue because he was vaccinated quite early on, and then as he looked at the data, he thought differently. Now, some people would still criticize that and say that not necessarily that you still encouraged the vaccine in some people when you had concerns. I will answer some of that. I think that I've always believed in targeted vaccinations. For those people who are at highest risk for severe disease, I think the concern about the side effects are not as significant. It's a risk-benefit decision. If you're at high risk for severe disease and you can have an intervention that reduces that risk, then it makes perfect sense. I think the concern comes, as you quite rightly said, as you shift down the groups, you then are thinking, how does that risk benefit alter? And is it the same risk benefit for a younger person with no comorbidities versus an older person? That kind of question. So what I'm curious about, Susan, is step back into the vaccine industry and the pharmaceutical industry for a second. When you saw this transition, where it was going down the line, what would they have been thinking? Because you're right, they wouldn't necessarily have known that governments were going to do this.
Right. When they were first asked to make these vaccines, we were really talking about vulnerable people. I mean, I remember that very clearly, and that's why I was so supportive that they were talking about a vaccine to help with these vulnerable groups. And that's where they thought the death rates would be, the high death rates. If I was sitting in a pharmaceutical company during that time, you'd be looking at that risk benefit, and you're supposed to submit that risk benefit to the regulators. I don't know what went on behind those closed doors, but I would be in a very difficult position to be able to say in these younger groups and especially with mandates, because the emergency drug release is to help in a pandemic, but nowhere did the FDA say in their approval that this would be mandated. That was a government decision. That was either CDC in the US. I don't know who made those decisions to mandate, but it ends up at the head of the country, Prime Minister in Canada, President in the US, Prime Minister in the UK. I'm not sure, but the mandates, I don't know what the pharmaceutical companies could have done about that. other than to say this was not developed to be forced on people because we're not giving out consent forms. People are not getting the full monograph that they would if this was a fully approved product. And when you get a drug from your pharmacy, they give you the monograph that tells you all the warnings, contraindications, the groups that they haven't done work in. You get that information. It's illegal not to give that information out. But when it's an emergency drug release, they don't need to give that out. So that is where the company, I think, should have started to object. But knowing that they weren't going to be liable, I would think that the shareholders may have put some pressure to say, it's not you that's made this decision. You're not marketing it this way. You are providing it through a contract to the governments, and they're the ones that are deciding how to distribute it. So that's where it becomes difficult when the product was approved for a certain indication. And as a regulatory person, I would have said, I did my job. I gave them all the data. The regulators have that. The indication that we put in there was reasonable. Then what happened after that? I have no idea how that all broke down and who was involved in discussions.
Yeah, it raises a question then. So say, for instance, Dr. Malhotra was talking about the fact that should the companies, the CEOs or I guess the senior people in these companies, if there is found to be an issue, should they be more than financially responsible, but criminally liable? That's a big step. Can you ever see, with what you said about the fact that there is no responsibility, is that ever even feasible?
I think it's going to be difficult with these COVID vaccines, but with products in the past, if it has been misbranded, if it's been marketed inappropriately, there are rules and the regulations that prevent you from doing that. And if the company is found guilty of doing that, I think they should be jailed. If the company, because the head of the company is responsible for everything, and ignorance is not an excuse. If your company does something wrong, it is the person at the top that is liable. The regulatory person, the medical director may also be hit, but the person at the top is the one that's responsible for making sure that their company is meeting all the requirements of regulation and law. And in this case, though, with the COVID, they knew there were problems with the vaccines. They knew they caused serious adverse events, but they communicated that to the regulators. So they didn't withhold that information. And it was the regulators that approved it. And then the government decided to mandate it. So it's very hard in this. So this is an unusual situation. I think it's going to be very hard to say that there should be jail time in this situation because they didn't make the decisions as to how these vaccines would be used. That was sort of taken out of their hands. They didn't market it for that. You don't see advertisements on the TV from Pfizer saying, everybody must get this. Like, they're not the ones doing that. And they're not the ones withholding the information. It was the regulators that said, under emergency drug release, we will not be getting informed consent because under emergency drug release, it can't be investigational. It can't be considered investigational. It is approved. So only investigational products require signed consent. So when it's not investigational, the signed consent's not required. Matter of fact, you can't even do it. And then there is no monograph being sent because it's not going through pharmacies or your doctor. It's going through clinics and we've got buses going around to this day. We have buses going around in Ontario giving out boosters and nobody's getting any information. They're just going to the bus, get their shot and go home. And they're not even keeping them for the 15 minutes anymore that they used to do to make sure they haven't had a serious adverse event. So it's a situation where I say everybody's responsible and nobody's accountable. It's a real mess.
Let me repeat that. Everybody is responsible and nobody is accountable. What a statement! Now, so one of the challenges, when we look at what has happened in the industry, and the pharma industry does have a bad reputation when it comes to sometimes doing stuff that is of not of benefit to the public, but financial benefit. Are we looking at another scenario like this where the whole industry will get tired with this viewpoint from the public? Is it fair?
I don't think it is fair because there were a lot of companies that had been working on that new technology that decided not to use it for the COVID vaccine. So I think there are companies that took advantage of the fact that they could get a technology that had not been approved quickly. I hope they won't be grandfathered, but we've already heard there's manufacturing plants going into Canada and Australia and the UK to make other vaccines using the same mRNA technology. I think that those vaccines are going to be tarred, that any vaccines made by that are probably not going to be well accepted by the public once all this comes out. But the companies that are still making vaccines by the old methodologies and do things the long way, I think it would be very unfair to put them in the same bucket as the ones that have taken advantage of the COVID pandemic.
I'm going to make an important statement here that I have always believed, and I still believe it. I believe the mRNA technology is phenomenal. And I have spoken to Robert Malone. I've listened to him talk about how the idea came, and I have seen the impact that it has in terms of producing an antibody response. So the technology works. You know what I think the problem is? We've picked the wrong disease. COVID-19, and I will say this openly, based on my research around autoimmunity, I've been saying this now for 2.5 years. It's a viral mediated autoimmune response that causes severe disease. How do you vaccinate against that? It's not, it's very difficult. And similar to another disease like dengue, where you can't really produce a vaccine because it risks increasing the risk of dengue hemorrhagic, COVID-19 may be one of those diseases where in a certain group, so it may still be beneficial in the high risk early in the pandemic, but at this stage, COVID-19 may not be able to be a disease that we can vaccinate against. That's a scientific question that I don't know if people have really put their mind to understand if this can be done. At what point, from a regulatory point of view, where would it be when you would say, okay, we've got a problem? What would have to happen?
Well, I'm not sure if I'd say when we have a problem. I'd be more likely to say, when do we have a success? I think the problem with the mRNA is you can't control the dose you're giving. You can control the dose of our mRNA you're giving, but you have no idea how much of that protein each body is going to produce. So in a regular vaccine or the historical vaccines, you give the same number of bacteria attenuated or inactivated, or virus inactivated or attenuated, the same number to every single person. So you know that you have consistency with dose. You do trials to do dose response. And at what level is it too much and what level is it not enough? With the mRNA, the body is manufacturing the protein that you want. So I don't think it was the right indication. I think they're actually doing trials in using the mRNA for pancreatic cancer, which my sister-in-law just died of 4 weeks ago. So something like that, where you have a very deadly disease and you treat people with it and you see whether it works. They should have been using it more for that before they started to get into mass vaccination, where you can't control the actual antigen dose. And that's the problem. We have no idea what the doses is for each individual person. And I think that's the problem with vaccines using that technology.
I'm going to share something with you, Susan, and this is interesting. As you said that with regards to the dose, I did an interesting post recently on my Substack, where it was looking at the antibody responses in people who had been vaccinated. The target range was 179 nanograms per mil to 800 nanograms per mil, and that's what they thought would have been protective levels of antibodies. When I looked at the over 80 group, the age over 80, who had been up to 3 or 4 doses, their antibody levels in 40% were over 6,000. Should that have been a red flag? I just can't understand why we would assume that antibody responses up to 10,000, 20,000 would be appropriate. What happens there? How does that miss the regulators?
Well, who did the study? And was that done by the regulators or the manufacturer? Because if not, then it probably wasn't submitted for review. I mean, you have these experiments being done everywhere, but they're not being sent to the regulators. Now, the company is supposed to keep track, at least when I was working with the companies, we were supposed to keep track of any studies done with our products and submit those to the regulators as additional scientific information. So whether or not the companies are monitoring those studies, maybe they are, and they'll say, well, we didn't like the way the study was conducted, or, there were some problems with the technology used to do the measurements. That's the problem with those kind of studies. Unless the manufacturer controls the study itself, they can discredit any study done with their product unless they do it themselves. And there's nothing to force them to try to replicate that study. So yes, if the company was doing that, and they should have been if they were doing long-term clinical trials, but they weren't, they should have been monitoring those things, and it should have put up a red flag. But I don't know that they're doing a lot of those kind of studies with their products. And that's what I meant. If the messenger RNA been worked on for a long time and hasn't been approved, except for a couple, maybe Ebola vaccine, it's been approved for a couple of vaccines, but these are in very small populations. They're not for mass vaccinations. The risk to that group is really high. So a technology has taken that long and still not on the market, and then they take advantage of a pandemic to get it on the market. It did leave a lot of questions in my mind about what was the real the rationale for doing it during a pandemic. And I think they weren't thinking of the disease, as you said, the disease that they were using it in. They just wanted to get that technology grandfathered.
Yeah, that's an important point. Well said, Susan. Here is the point that I think I'm most worried about. This was said by Stephanie. We've got lots of comments, but I can't really go through all of them. But here is what she said that really is worrying. Question all vaccines now. Now, this is what is happening, and this has been the biggest danger to public health, is the damage that is going to happen to a technology that has been around for a long time. What do you say?
All I can say is those vaccines that have been around for a long time, we know what their safety profile is. We know that they're efficacious. I wouldn't question the vaccines like tetanus, diphtheria, polio, any of those vaccines that have been around for a long time, influenza. But as soon as a new technology is used to make some of those vaccines or all of them, I think then we all should be questioning those vaccines. That is my personal opinion. I think we have to be careful with new technologies because especially when there is an urgency to getting them out there on the market, and it's, it was perceived that we needed it. Now, I know people will comment, well, the COVID vaccine saved a lot of lives. How do we know that? How do we know it saved a lot of lives? Because it mutated into less severe variants. So was that why, it just happened to coincide with the rollout of the vaccines? The fact that people that thought they were vulnerable were staying inside. They weren't going to restaurants. They weren't traveling. So can we say for certain that these vaccines save lives? I don't think we can. The data don't prove that. All we know is there's not as many deaths since the rollout, but there were a lot of other things going on at the same time that there were treatments that were being used to save lives. There were anti-inflammatories being given. There were all kinds of other treatments that were being given around the same time that the vaccines were rolled out. So it's really hard unless you have a controlled clinical trial where you control for everything. You don't treat anybody. Everybody's treated the same way. You give them the vaccine. You have a long time to monitor it, 1 or 2 years to see what's going on. Not 3-month study where they say within the 3 months they had 1 placebo get infected and 3 vaccinated, or the other way around, and 3 vaccinated, infected, or unvaccinated. Anyway, it was a very small number of people, but they were able to say it worked. But once you get out into the real world where people are taking drugs, they're self-treating. For instance, my husband and I are not vaccinated. We went 2 years wearing masks, not going to crowds. We were not allowed to go to restaurants or travel anyway because we were unvaccinated. So we couldn't go anywhere where there was a crowd. We didn't get COVID. Then we let our guard down 2 months ago. And we went places without our masks. We went to some social clubs. We got COVID. My husband has MS. I have autoimmune conditions. We were over it in 5 days. From beginning to having no symptoms at all. We were over it. I think we were previously exposed. We had natural immunity. But over those 2 years, not only did we not get COVID, we didn't get the flu. We didn't get the cold. We didn't get anything. We were the healthiest we'd been in a long time, those 2 years that we stayed away from everybody and protected ourselves. So there are a lot of people that were doing that, even though they were vaccinated. They were protecting themselves, so they weren't getting it. So again, people will tell you, you'll get comments saying, but it saved so many people, so don't be going against these vaccines. It saved a whole bunch of people, but you don't know that. But the old vaccines, we do know that. We know what polio does. We know what diphtheria and tetanus and meningitis does for children. We know they work. We know that's worth the few, and yet their adverse events are very, a lot less frequent than the COVID one. And you can talk about numbers. People say, well, there's only X number of people that actually had a serious adverse event, but you've got to look in percentages vaccinated. So yes, millions have received these vaccines, and there hasn't been a really high incidence of these effects. The issue for me is, but nobody is being told there is a chance you could get myocarditis. There is a chance you can have a stroke, to allow you to make that decision yourself. That is the problem, not the issue that there's adverse events, because for every benefit, there's an adverse effect in any product that you take. But you need to be told. You need to be told what those risks are so that you can make that decision yourself. And an 80-year-old is going to make a different decision than a 40-year-old as far as long-term risks. So I think that's the issue today, is the lack of communication.
Wow, I am so appreciative of you saying these things, Susan, because we don't hear this from anyone who has been in the pharmaceutical industry. I tried for a long time to try and get people to speak, and no one wanted to speak. And so as we come to the end, I want to ask a hard question. Are they also part of the problem? When we look back historically and we come, and you may find in 50 years' time, they look back and they say, how could this have happened? Was their silence a contributory factor to what we see now?
Yes, their silence is a contributing factor. But on the other hand, it takes, I'm not saying I'm courageous, I'm just probably stupid, but it takes a lot of courage to come out and say publicly, because we have seen what happens to people that come out publicly. I'm going to mention someone like Jordan Peterson. He comes out publicly, he's at risk of losing his license to practice. I mean, that takes a lot of courage to do that. And you have to think to yourself, do I have other avenues? If I get removed from the career that I have worked so hard for, is there something else I'll be able to do with my life? Because I am going to be blackballed anywhere I go to apply. So it is tough. So yes, they were contributors, but on the other hand, that is what society has turned us all into, is we just keep quiet because it can affect you, your family, your career. And look at how nasty people get with people that come out and raise concerns. I mean, they're attacked from every direction. So I can't blame people for being silent, but I'm hoping that more people will start coming out and talking about things like me that have, I'm retired. The only thing I have is my friends are now going to attack me for saying these things, but that's too bad. But that's, I think that is the concern, is society has forced us all to be quiet. And unless there's enough people speaking out that other people can join that group and start speaking out because they feel they've got the support of numbers, it takes a while for the first few people to have the courage to come out and say things. But I'm hoping there'll be some momentum, like a snowball. There'll be more and more people starting to come out and join the group of people speaking out. I don't think it's too late, but I think they have to stop giving these boosters so that people can clear this out of their system and not have to worry about it.
Wow. I appreciate it so much, Susan. And just again for our audience to realize, we decided to do this only about 2.5 hours before we went live. And Susan was so instrumental in giving such insight into the industry that you've worked at for over 40 years and seeing the transition and sharing that transition. So we're all now better educated about the challenges that lie ahead, because the reality is that if we don't fix these issues now, we may end up in the same kind of problem in the future. And so it does require a degree of insight into what is happening and what is going on. So what are your final comments, Susan, as we close out?
I'm not sure if I've got anything more to add, except that I just think people have to start really listening to people that have got expertise and not just to their politicians. I think they have to start looking at not blaming individuals with expertise for having spoken out. And if you don't like what they're saying, condemn them. I think this has been seen over and over again, where individuals that have had years of Nobel Prizes and all kinds of things, and then they come out and they speak to something that is difficult, and all of a sudden they're considered a pariah. They just nobody wants to talk to them, nobody wants them on their show, and everybody's calling them all kinds of names. So I think in this case, that tweet, the tweets that are talking about that, we need to sue the CEO. I think we have to think beyond that. We have to think beyond blaming. I think we have to think about what is the best for everybody and start forming, some way of making your own decisions a little bit better than we have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you very much to everyone who has been here with us. We've got so many comments, I can't show them, but we'll try and respond to them in time. Have a great evening, everyone. Thanks again, Susan, and I'll ask you to wait with me for a few minutes as we do our ending video. Thank you, everybody.
My pleasure. Thank you.